Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the brain, the injured brain. I think concussion is turning into a major topic for the American public and now abroad as well. I think everyone's very concerned about traumatic brain injury and especially kids playing, I think, football, but I'll get into, we see concussions in all sports. So I take care of all the Stanford athletes. I see them immediately after a concussion and follow up with them. I also have a clinic, the Neuroscience Health Center at Stanford, where we see people from outside. And so I see both the athletes and people from outside, car accidents, falling off their horses. Around Palo Alto, there's a lot of biking accidents. They have windy roads and cars hit them. And so I'm a neurosurgeon, and my DNA is really severe traumatic brain injury. I founded the Brain Trauma Foundation 30 years ago, and basically they do the national guidelines for severe traumatic brain injury. I started SyncThink a few years ago because I was very interested in how people pay attention and realized that it's a major problem in concussion. But as I was thinking about this whole problem and going from taking care of people in coma and then people with concussion, the brain is really designed to interact with the outside world. And we have a major problem. The problem is that there's a delay in sensory motor processing. And we all want to act in real time. We all want to be in real time and interact. And in order to do that, you actually have to be in the future. That's the only way to get over that hump. And so our brains are actually about 2.5 seconds in the future. We act in the present moment, and we sense in the past. So we're sort of unconsciously in the future. We're acting in the present moment, and we're in the past consciously. So by the time you sense something, it's already happened. So it's a very difficult thing. Now, we're not aware of it. We're only aware of the milliseconds after an action is done. And we seem to be in the present moment, but we're really not. And I think that time has always been a very difficult topic, both in philosophy and in neuroscience. And I think that neuroscience deals a lot with, well, once the information comes in, where does it go? And how is it acted upon? And we know the brain areas that do that pretty well. But the real problem is, how do you select the information in time and space and interact with it in real time? And that's where my interest has really been. I realized that to pay attention, like you are right now, you really have to have an expectation of the next thing that's going to happen. And so you're always expecting. Your brain is, I like to say, in a predictive brain state. And you're constantly in that state, and you do it unconsciously. You get error signals when the unexpected happens. And so, so I really got into thinking about the timing aspect of how the brain interacts with the outside world. And this concept of having to be predictive, I thought was really important. And I wanted to see if, I think in concussion, there's a problem with prediction. And I'm going to use a lot of words. There's a lot of labels on things. And as a doctor, I get frustrated because we can't get other disciplines like physicists and mathematicians, people that can really solve problems, into the area of medicine, and especially neuroscience, because we've got lots of labels. We got medical diagnoses labels. We got concussion, ADHD, dementia, and we got labels in the brain, parietal lobe, cerebellum, so on. And they often block people from understanding it. And I think if you look at the brain as an organ that wants to interact with the outside world, and you give it to the engineers, they can figure out pretty quickly what kind of systems you need. You need feedback systems, you need feed-forward systems, and those pathways are all in the brain. It's just we have different labels on them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about orientation. So I equate orientation, attention, and synchronization all together. When you synchronize the outside world, that's when you attend to stimuli. And you're also orienting towards it. So, and I think that the orientation part, to me, is a better term because you're orienting to things that are moving in the outside world, and you're also orienting with your moving with respect to the outside world. And most of your orientation is visual. So, in this talk, I'm going to be using concussion as an example of acute disorientation and how we can measure that with the eyes. And then get into some of the metrics with the technology that was developed by SyncThink. So a lot of people, I call it the fog of concussion. A lot of people think that we know what concussion is. We have diagnostic criteria, and the NFL is just ignoring it. And in actual fact, there are no diagnostic criteria for concussion. Your doctor will make the diagnosis. They make a diagnosis of concussion, but there's no accepted diagnostic criteria. And so we have a huge interest in the public, and we have lots of diagnostics and therapeutics out there, but we have an undefined condition. That's a recipe for a disaster. And especially if there's any investors in here, trying to get into a market where you have an undefined condition, you're going to have a situation where you test your technology, but half the people are normal. And then you compare it to a control group, you're not going to see efficacy. So it's really, really a big problem. So this is the thing that really gets people going. The film Concussion, Will Smith, was a really well-made film on CTE, discovery of CTE. The recent article in JAMA on the NFL brains that went viral, and there's actually another article that's coming out soon, which will even get more press, that shows even a brief stint in football will lead to a significant increase in CTE. So I think everyone's going to pull their 8-year-olds out. We're already seeing a big decline in kids playing football. And I think the tragedy is that kids are sedentary. There's a real rise in kids becoming sedentary. And with this kind of news, it's going to get even worse. And kids need to play sports. We just have to make it safer. And I think all this is really driving a lot of the public's angst in this area. A lot of people are trying to solve the problem, and you got a problem that's undefined. It's kind of a perfect storm. So I'm going to go through some of what's going on right now in the concussion space, and I divided it up into what we need on the sidelines for sports and what we have for people that come into clinic, and this is also for sports. One thing is we have to detect. So somebody has a head injury. You can be a spotter and just observe somebody. They have spotters now for like Pac-12 and for the NFL. And I've talked to some of the spotters, and they said, well, you guys want the clock going? Or so I still have 25 minutes. Good. The spotters, I said, well, how do you recognize a concussion? And the spotter says, well, if he kneels down and shakes his head, that's a very strong idea that they may have a concussion. That's where we are basically right now. And this is an NFL spotter. So so people have been trying to figure out, well, it's some kind of force to the head. Let's put an accelerometer on the head and figure out obviously if they get a really big force, they're going to have a concussion. If they get a small force, they won't get a concussion. And they do those studies, and there's no correlation. And people get huge forces to the head and not have neurological impairment. People get small force and do have it. The other problem is a lot of these sensors are sitting on the skin or outside. The skin moves, the scalp moves, so they're not accurate. The best ones are ones that either lock onto the teeth or go into some kind of bony canal, and then you can get a better measurement. So this technology is in evolution right now. So we're left with spotters, people on the sidelines or people sitting up in the stands trying to figure out what the problem is. On the sideline, we have this thing called the SCAT, which is the Standardized Concussion Assessment Test, and they ask you to memorize words. They ask you about your balance, and they put fingers in front of your eyes like this, and it's pretty good. It's okay. But it does take 20 minutes to do it. There's reading cards. This is our test. It's with VR goggles with eye trackers built into it. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. Drawing blood is great because the brain releases certain proteins, and might be able to tell if a person had an injury or not. And this is a very big area of research right now, but it's not ready for prime time yet. There's a lot of different molecules. There's obviously there's an acute phase, and then there's a chronic phase, and so we're not there yet. So right now we're left really with these kinds of technologies on the sidelines plus the spotter. And in the clinic we can use neurocognitive testing. A lot of schools get neurocognitive testing for baseline, and then they compare it to afterwards. And there's this whole notion of you take a picture of a person before the injury, you take a picture afterwards, and you compare the two, and you see if there's a difference. This concept has been around a lot, and a lot of people use it, and it's reaction times. You get a slower reaction time when you after concussion compared to your baseline. The problem is that the baseline testing has a lot of learning effects and effort issues, and we're not really picking up a biological signal. We're just saying they're slow. There's a lot of reasons why you can be slow in a reaction time. I'm going to show you that with the eye tracking, you get a unique signal for concussion. EEG is another big area of doing this on the sidelines and in the clinics. And then imaging. You think an imaging and MRI would diagnose a concussion. The problem is that 90% of the imaging studies are normal. And so that's not helpful. It's good in more severe cases. We can see some shearing and things like that. So what's really going on here in concussion? And there's over 4 million cases. You always see these things. About 17 kids die each year playing football, and they think it's from second impact syndrome, where they had a concussion, they were sent back in. Obviously, there's trillions of hits. There's no correlation here. This is a much more severe injury, and these kids usually have subdural hematomas, a lot of shearing injury. But the main problem with concussion is really, and we did a study of 5,000 research articles and found that attention impairment disorientation is the main problem in concussion. So we get into attention, orientation, synchronization. What is it? And so attention is really orienting to space and time. That's there's basically, physicists tell you the space and time. There's basically 3 dimensions plus time. We're not going to get into whether time's a dimension or not. If you've seen Interstellar, you might be able to explore about the 5th dimension and things like that. It's very interesting, but right now we've got our own problems here in terms of just plain orienting. The brain has got a delay in processing. So 80% of our attention is visual, requiring spatial and temporal prediction. And disruption of this causes a feeling of brain fog, dazed, out of sync. And that's what we see in concussion. So here's another example. By the time this tennis player sees that ball, it's over there. So he has to swing his racket before the ball gets there. In fact, that's what we're doing all the time. We're swinging our rackets before the information comes in, both motorically and cognitively. I made that example where I stopped talking, all of a sudden you got an error signal because you're expecting something. Your brain is in a predictive state, and we have to swing our rackets before the information gets in there. And so we need to have spatial and temporal prediction. We need timing and spatial prediction to be able to function in real time and to interact. Well, how do we assess that? What's a way of measuring? I like to measure things. What's the best way of measuring it? Well, you can do reaction times. However, you get a lot of muscles involved there and a lot of other things. But the unique thing about the eyes are you have to foveate. This is in primates and man. And your cats and dogs don't have foveas. They move their heads or have saccadic eye movements. But humans and primates have smooth. If you saw Jurassic Park with the dinosaurs, you notice that their eyes have smooth pursuit. Their eyes move back and forth, and that terrifies people because it's a sign of intelligence. So shark movies, you see the eyes move. They don't do that. They have saccadic eye movements. So when you're following something, if you look at here, you're really when you're looking at your thumb going back and forth, you're foveating. This is your size of your fovea, and everything else is a blur. And so that requires extremely good prediction, right? Following this back, but because by the time I see that, it's somewhere else. And I want the information to land in my fovea, so I have to follow it very well. So you can measure eye movements as a sensory motor system looking for synchronization. So this is the iSync technology that we developed with SyncThink. And I like to think of this as you orienting to the world. There's 4 different ways you can do it. The outside world can be still, and you can be still. That's called fixation. Then the outside world can move, and you're still, and that's our test at smooth pursuit. And then the outside world is still, and you're moving, and that's called vestibular balance assessment. And then they're both moving together, and that's interaction. So I made it sort of 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1. And this is what has to be evaluated to assess somebody's orientation. And right now in neurology, we say somebody's oriented times 3. You ask them where they are, what the date is. I mean, that's not, I consider that to be working memory. That's not orientation. You want to take a person, spin them around, and see if they can get oriented. And that's called orientation of dynamic space. So it turns out this circuit for attention orientation is really the prefrontal cortex, parietal lobe, and cerebellum. So the way I like to think of this is the prefrontal cortex says, I want to hit a tennis ball. The parietal lobe says, I'll tell you where it is. And the cerebellum tells you when it's going to be there. And the cerebellum is actually really interesting because, and I'll show you the data on this, it's a feed-forward inhibitory timing. So it doesn't tell you what the time is. It just holds back your motor or cognitive function till just the moment where the sensory information comes in and it releases it. And I'll show you that in some of the eye tracking. So the injury we see in traumatic brain injury is all in the front. A lot of people think that, you hit your head back here and the occipital lobe is damaged. I've never operated on, I've never taken a blood clot out of the occipital lobe. And if you talk to most neurosurgeons, sometimes you get epidurals back here, but you never get damage back here. It's all in the front. Why? Because, and this is another pearl, it's a neck that's causing the concussion. Okay, well, the problem with head movement is the neck is flexible and it whips the front part. The front part's farthest away from the fulcrum of axis. As the engineering, if to explain to the engineers how traumatic a brain injury occurs, they go, yeah, well, then why are we designing helmets? Well, because it's a sort of Newtonian thinking, because if the neck was made of iron and it wasn't moving, then you design a helmet, right? So the forces hit and you absorb it. But the neck moves, and that's the problem. The neck moving, so that's why 8-year-olds and women get more concussions, because they have big brains and small necks. And so they whip around a lot. So you look at the flexibility of an 8-year-old or women, they have a lot of flexibility in their neck, and it whips the brain around, and all the damage is in the front. That's where the neurosurgeons operate. It's frontal lobe and temporal lobe, it's all up here, because that's where the whip is. There's a engineer in St. Louis, Washington University, Phil Bailey, that's dropped people in MRI and does rapid sequencing as their head moves. And he's shown that the front part of the brain is where the most shearing occurs. So the frontal lobes go like this. And when they go like this, that's where tiny tears occur, and we get all the problems in here. An old model we thought about traumatic brain injuries is like an artichoke that you shake like this. And it's the front part of the artichoke that gets the most whiplash. So we don't see the injury back here. It's all in the front and all on the top of the brainstem. And that's where we see the eye movement problems. So so I like to say the future of technology is in the eyes. The eyes are the window of the brain. I think you're going to see a lot more eye technology, whether it be pupil reflex or eye movements. I think eye movements themselves are very revealing. I mean, if you're having a conversation with somebody, you're not looking at their left hand. You're looking at their eyes to see if they're paying attention to you. And you can tell by the movement in their eyes whether they're interested, not interested. You're going to change the topic. You're going to increase the pace of your conversation or decrease the pace of your conversation, but you're getting it from the person's eyes. And all we're doing is taking that information and translating it into metrics. So this is the product. SyncThink. So this was funded by the military. We got over $30 million in funding to do clinical trials. We did 10,000. We just finished a 10,000 person normative database, both military and civilian. We got FDA approval for picking up eye tracking impairments. And it takes, the actual test is 30 seconds, and a report comes out within a minute. So this is the latest version. We used Oculus Rift before, but now we're using Gear VR. We put in eye tracking cameras, and I think I have a picture of that. Yeah, so here's a regular Samsung Gear VR with a Samsung phone in the front, but it doesn't have eye trackers. So we actually have a company that puts in eye trackers. This eye tracking company just got bought by Apple. So you can see where they're going. So actually, Facebook, Google, Apple, Microsoft, they're all buying eye tracking companies. So that's not what we do. What we do is we take the position of the eye and do analytics compared to the target. That's where the company's IP is located. So here's a person looking around at a circle. We have a dot going around a circle. Show the next slide. So the dot going around a circle. It takes, we do this, it goes around for 15 seconds, and we look at the position of the eye compared to the target, and we look at the variance in this direction, that direction. The problem with synchronization, orientation, if you're not synchronized or orient, the product of that is variance, is variability. And so, and we measure that. And that's strongly correlated with the level of attention. So here's a normal person. We can see each one of these is a position of the eye. It seems like it's going around a circle. And compared to the target, very little variance in this direction and this direction. Here's what we see in concussion, though. The eyes are, you'd think the person would be just slow, right? The eyes would just be slow compared to the target. They're not. They're jumping ahead to where the target's going to be. So this was revealing what's happening or how your brain works. Your brain is actually in the future, and the way that you end up in the present moment is by inhibiting that. And the way I like to say that is you break the future to be in the present. So everyone's predictive. I think you're born with prediction. We've done this in kids, and they all have prediction. What happens is you're controlling the variance by having inhibitory control, feed-forward inhibitory control. And that break is in the prefrontal cortex. That's what controls, that's all inhibition. And we see people in concussion, the brakes don't work, and they jump ahead into the future. Their eyes jump ahead. And they're also cranky, they're impulsive, all the things we know in traumatic brain injury. But here we're seeing the actual signal in eye tracking. Okay, if you can put the video on quickly, I'll just show you. Here's the right eye and left eye following a normal person. They're following it really well. I'm going to show you what happens in concussion. You can see that well synchronized, following it around. And now we have a person with concussion. Look what happens. He's following it there, but look what happens. It's jumping ahead to where the target's going to be. You see those little jumps ahead? You couldn't do this if you tried. This is what we, you can't do smooth pursuit without following a target. So, and then afterwards, after recovery, he's improved, but still has a little bit of jumps here and there. Next, I'll just quickly go through the next few slides. It was me. Okay. So we do this on the Stanford sidelines. We do the eye tracking. We've been doing it for 2 years now. The whole Pac-12 now is going to be adopting this technology for assessing concussion. And we have fast recovery in the athletes, and we have slower recovery. And what happens is you're leaning forward with acute concussion that improves over time. And then we also did sleep deprivation. We took 100 soldiers, sleep deprived them. What happened was we get variance in this direction. So it's completely different from concussion. So we can separate sleep deprivation from concussion and look at recovery. And then what we do in the clinic is we do exercise. There's a huge epidemic of kids that are depressed and chronically fatigued because of not getting exercise. And so we put everyone, all the athletes go on a treadmill or stationary bike immediately, and that gets them better. Sleep is really important. I won't get into that. And we have Pac-12, Mass General Hospital. We've got Texas, a bunch of the Golden State Warriors just got trained yesterday. They're using the eye tracking technology. And this is something that goes for a lifetime, measuring visual orientation from development in kids to fatigue and then to dementia. And just for the future, we can use eye tracking technology to look at the person's level of attention and have content change accordingly. And I think that could be the interaction for AI. Okay, and we're done. Any questions? Thank you for your attention.